Chapter 2. Riley Flowers walked through her new business venture 15 minutes before the grand opening, making sure that everything was ready. She sipped coffee from a huge travel mug that she'd most likely kill before noon. Some people got jittery and suffered from lack of sleep if they drank as much coffee as her, but Riley thrived on the brew. Coming back up to the sales counter, Riley sat her coffee down and took a calming breath as she looked through the large glass double doors. Several vehicles pulled into the parking lot, and she tried not to become too excited. People often came to grand openings out of curiosity and for whatever freebies were offered, but most of them didn't turn out to be repeat customers. Still, she'd be grateful for each person who showed up because they were walking, talking advertisements. Many of them would mention their visit to at least one other person who would also pass it on. This was the most crucial day of her life, even more important than her wedding 3 years ago. This was the start of a new life far away from her old one. She was going to be happy and successful if it killed her. At 5 to 7, she stepped over to the doors and unlocked them. Opening the right-hand one, she put a big smile on her face and motioned the people approaching the doors inside. "Good morning, folks. It's good to see you. Come on in. Welcome to the Bits and Buckets Depot," she called out. "I have fresh coffee and donuts for everyone." She held the door open for the 11 people who filed through it. Most of them smiled and greeted her before they started looking around. A couple of guys made a beeline for the refreshments arranged on a long counter against the back wall, while a woman who was obviously a rancher started looking at her selection of bridles. A middle-aged woman with thick blonde hair, pulled into a ponytail, approached her. "Hi, I'm Delia Lightfoot." Riley took the hand she held out to her. "Riley Flowers. It's great to meet you, Delia." "Same here," Delia said. "Congratulations on your new business." "Thanks. Would you like some coffee and donuts?" Riley asked. "No thanks, hon. We already ate," Delia replied. "I'd like you to meet my son, Calvin. He's the town treasurer." Riley looked where Delia indicated. A man stood with his back to her, looking at a long shelving unit of grooming supplies. Faded jeans showed off a very fine male behind and long legs. His black and red checkered flannel jacket hung on a frame that looked strong, yet not brawny. "Calvin, get your ass over here." Riley's eyebrows rose in surprise at Delia's authoritative tone. Her gaze shifted back to the man who was apparently Calvin. His shoulders tensed a little, but he didn't pay Delia any heed otherwise. He continued perusing the brushes and hoof picks, and Riley had the distinct impression that he was hiding. "Calvin!" Delia's voice held warning. Calvin put down the curry brush he'd just picked up. Squaring his shoulders as though bracing himself, he turned towards them and walked over with stiff, deliberate steps. His strange gait made Riley wonder if he'd recently suffered an injury. "Calvin, this is Riley Flowers," Delia said. "Riley, my son, Calvin." Calvin flicked an annoyed glance at Delia. "I know who she is." Calvin's short, coal-black hair peeked out from under his scruffy, black leather cowboy hat. His Native American heritage was evident in his deep brown eyes, slightly aquiline nose, and chiseled cheekbones. His eyes met Riley's. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am." Her attention became riveted on his mouth when the right side lifted in a half-smile. He had the most beautiful male lips she'd ever seen, and she could imagine kissing them for hours. Riley also noted that he stood around 5'11" and admired his physique. Calvin wasn't muscle-bound, but his shoulders and chest filled out his jacket nicely, indicating that his lean frame held power. As her eyes ran down over his arms, her gaze settled on his hands, which were as beautiful as his mouth. He held one out to her. "Likewise, Calvin." She enjoyed the feel of his warm, rough palm for a few brief moments as they shook hands. "I'm glad you came to the grand opening." Calvin shot a hard look at Delia. "She made me." He seemed as surprised at his blurted comment as Riley. "That came out wrong. I meant that I was sort of in the middle of something at home when Mom decided to come." Delia said, "Quit your whining and enjoy yourself." Her smile turned sly. "Seems like the view in here is nice." Calvin's jaw tightened and Riley blushed slightly at Delia's pointed statement. Jabbing a thumb over his shoulder, Calvin said, "I'm going to check out the grooming stuff. I'll be over there." Delia's blue eyes sparkled with humor as he strode away from them. "Don't take it personally, Riley. Calvin's a little shy around the ladies," she said in a lowered voice. Riley chuckled. "Oh, he's one of those, then." "One of those?" Delia queried. "The kind of guy who doesn't know he's good-looking." Calvin jerked a little, but Riley was sure that he was too far away to hear her quiet murmur to Delia. "That's an understatement," Delia said. Calvin walked toward the back of the store as though trying to get away from them, and Riley frowned. She'd never had someone act so uncomfortable around her before. However, she had work to do and couldn't dwell on it. Shrugging off her concerns, she excused herself and went to help a couple who had questions about lunge lines. Calvin was impressed by the wide selection of merchandise and how well Riley had organized the place. He liked that, although the wide planked wooden floors were new, she'd kept the rustic pine interior of the place. Looking overhead, he saw that skylights had been installed, allowing plenty of natural light into the depot. They would help keep the electrical costs down. As he checked out which brands of horse coat conditioners and liniments Riley stocked, Calvin's irritation with Delia ebbed. He knew she meant well, but he was tired of her throwing him at every available female. "I wish Mom would get it through her hard head that I don't want anything to do with women. Well, okay, there are some things I'd like to do with them, but I don't want a relationship. Not going to make that mistake again." He walked around a corner and found himself facing a wall of all manner of whips. Anger heated his blood as his gaze traveled over them. "Can I help you find something?" Calvin whirled around at the voice. Normally he'd have heard her, but he'd been too preoccupied. Riley stood behind him, a friendly smile curving her full mouth. He shook his head. "No, She moved past him and took a riding crop that had been hung incorrectly with a buggy whip off the hook. "Do you raise horses?" Calvin flinched when she slapped the whip lightly against her thigh and then twirled it. His jaw worked as he fought the impulse to snatch the whip from her with his teeth and bite it in half. "Yeah, a few. But I don't use those damn things on them. No need to." Riley's lovely blue eyes widened. "I'm sorry." "You should be." He pointed at the whips. "Selling these just gives people the idea that it's okay to whip horses." Riley's mouth dropped open at his harsh words. His dark eyes gleamed with anger and fear. She moved to hang the whip on the proper hook and was amazed to see his nostrils flare as his eyes followed it. She'd seen that look before, but never on a human. He took a step back. "Horses have feelings too, you know." "Of course they do." Calvin had to get away from the whips. He knew that he was making an ass out of himself, but he couldn't help it. "I better be going. I have a bunch of stuff to do today. Good luck with everything." There, that was nicer. He gave her a stiff smile and walked past her towards the front of the store. As he went down the aisle containing various sizes of bird and chicken feed, he bumped a 10-pound bag of birdseed with his elbow. The slippery plastic bag slid off the shelf and fell to the floor. It burst, spilling birdseed everywhere. Calvin went stock still, his hands clenched as embarrassment and anger flowed through his veins. Shit. He turned around to face Riley. "I'm so sorry. I'll pay for it." To his surprise, Riley wasn't angry. Her eyes glittered with restrained laughter. "Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal." Calvin looked down at the mess he'd made. "If you get me a broom and a dustpan, I'll clean it up." Riley nodded. "Okay, I'll be right back." As she walked away, Calvin couldn't help noticing Riley's sweetly rounded rear end as it moved beneath her black jeans. She had the kind of hips a man could hold on to during lovemaking. Calvin ripped his gaze away from the enticing sight before someone caught him staring. Along the way to the storeroom, Riley pondered Calvin's odd behavior about the whips. The fear in his eyes made her think that he'd had a bad experience with them. Had he seen a horse abused with one and now couldn't stand them? She greeted and helped a couple of customers along her way. Nearing the front counter, she saw Nate Nichols, her assistant manager, ringing up sales. 3 people stood in line behind Delia, who was purchasing a bag of sweet feed. It didn't look like people were buying a whole lot, but every sale counted. Nate smiled when Riley told him what had happened. "Calvin is a walking disaster." Everyone holds their breath when he comes around because he's so clumsy. Riley chuckled and went on her way. She grabbed a broom and dustpan and returned to Calvin, who held out his hand for the broom. I can get this, Riley said. No, I made the mess. I'll clean it up. His stubborn expression told Riley that he wasn't going to give in. All right. Calvin took the equipment and started sweeping the seed into a pile. Riley couldn't stop watching him as he worked. Nate had called Calvin clumsy, but his movements were graceful. She'd never been so affected by a man's hands before, and she smiled inwardly at her preoccupation with that part of his anatomy. Once he'd gathered the seed, Calvin crouched and swept it into a dustpan. His powerful olfactory senses picked up the scent of female pheromones, the kind a woman released when she found a man attractive. Slowly looking up at Riley, he saw it in her eyes. The animal in him responded, but his human mind rejected the idea that she found him appealing. Returning his attention to cleaning up, he emptied the dustpan into the small bucket Riley had brought with her. Rising, he was careful not to upset the bucket. Where should I dump this? He asked. Those little invisible molecules of attraction still wafted from Riley. She tucked her hair behind her ear, releasing more of them. The stallion in Calvin almost went berserk, and he barely kept from tossing his head and snorting. But that would be majorly weird and send her running for the hills. He'd already insulted her and made a mess in her store. That was enough humiliation for one day. Riley reached for the bucket and broom. I'll take it out back and spread the seed around for the birds. Her smile revealed pretty white teeth, and Calvin imagined how good it would feel if she bit him. No sense in it going to waste. Calvin handed them over. Okay, I'll stop up front and pay for it. That's really not necessary. Yes, it is, he smiled, and the expression added warmth to his eyes, making him even handsomer. The customer's always right? Fine, you can pay for it, Riley said grudgingly. Thank you. Calvin resisted the urge to shuffle his feet like a bashful teenager. Well, I better not keep Mom waiting. Sorry again for making a mess. See you later. See ya. Riley watched him walk away and decided that he would indeed see her again. Clumsy or not, he was hot, and she'd seen the glimmer of attraction in his eyes. Plotting her next move, Riley got rid of the bird seed and went back inside to make sure the grand opening was running smoothly.